The morning Della Crane rode onto the Whitfield property. She had 17 cents in her coat pocket, a horse that hadn't eaten since Tuesday, and a lie she hadn't quite decided whether to tell. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared at the edge of the property line where the fence had rotted clean through, and someone had replaced 3 posts with rough pine that didn't match the rest. She sat in the saddle and looked at the house. The house looked back. It was a working ranch once. Anyone could see that. The bones were still good. A wide barn set back from the main house, a water tank that had been prepared at least twice in different hands, a chicken yard with actual chickens in it. But the place had the look of something running on memory, the kind of ranch that keeps going because the people in it don't know how to stop. A man came out onto the porch. He was past 60, square-shouldered still, with the deliberate movement of someone whose back had been giving him trouble for years, but who refused to mention it. He held nothing in his hands, which Della noticed. That was either a good sign or the kind of confidence that comes from knowing where the rifle is. "You lost," he called out. "No, sir," Della said. "I'm looking for Chester Whitfield." The man was quiet a moment. "You found him." She dismounted before he invited her to. That was intentional. She tied the horse to the fence post, the new pine one, and walked to the edge of the porch steps and stopped. She didn't come up. That was intentional, too. "My name is Della Crane," she said. "I heard in Red Fork you might be short a hand." Chester Whitfield looked at her the way men of his generation looked at things that didn't fit the category they expected. Not meanly, just slowly recalibrating. "Who told you that?" Man at the feed store. Didn't catch his name. Big fella, red suspenders, that'd be Mick Dooley. Chester took one step forward on the porch. Mick Dooley ought to mind his own business. "Maybe so," Della said. "But I'm here now." The screen door opened behind Chester and a woman appeared. She was smaller than her husband, with gray hair pinned up and eyes that moved faster than the rest of her. She looked at Della and said nothing, but her hand stayed on the door frame and she didn't go back inside. "I can't pay much," Chester said finally. "I'm not asking for much. A place to sleep and meals. I'll work for the rest." Something crossed the woman's face. Not softness exactly, something more careful than that. "We tried that before," the woman said. "Didn't work out." "That's so," Della said. She wasn't asking. She just let the words sit there and didn't try to argue them away, which was perhaps the only smart thing she did in that first 5 minutes. Chester and the woman, her name was Louisa. Della would learn. Louisa Whitfield, a woman who had been on that land for 31 years and intended to die on it, exchanged a look that had a whole conversation inside it, the kind of look that takes decades to develop. Della had seen her parents exchange looks like that once, a long time ago before everything went the way it went. "We'll think on it," Chester said. "You can water your horse." That was the first day. What Della didn't tell them that morning, what she carried in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed, was that she'd been let go from the Renner operation outside of Pickett 3 weeks prior, not for poor work. She'd worked the Renner cattle for 2 seasons and she knew it. She'd been let go because Tom Renner's son, Dale, had decided she owed him something she didn't owe him, and when she made that clear with words and then with her elbow, in a way that left a mark, Tom Renner had come to her bunkhouse the following morning and told her it would be better for everyone if she moved along. She'd moved along. She didn't tell Chester and Louisa any of that. She told them she'd worked cattle in the eastern part of the state for 2 years, which was true. She told them she was good with horses and decent with a fence line, which was also true. She told them she was looking for steady work in the valley, which was true in the way that leaving out the why of a thing can still be true. What she hadn't expected, riding onto the Whitfield property, was to feel anything in particular. She was past feeling things about places. She'd learned that the hard way, you attach to a piece of land, and then the land gets taken from you, or you get taken from it, and the attachment just becomes another wound to carry. So she'd stopped doing it. 2 years on the road and she'd gotten good at seeing ranches as arrangements of fences and water and grass, and nothing more. But there was something about the Whitfield place that got under her skin before she'd even dismounted. Maybe it was the kitchen garden she spotted along the south side of the house, tomatoes staked and tied with strips of cloth, squash running along the ground, a row of something she thought might be beans. Someone was still putting care into that garden even when everything else was stretched thin. Or maybe it was the way the barn door had been painted, not recently a dark red, that had weathered to something close to rose, and the color in the afternoon light was— She didn't have a word for it. She just looked at it longer than she should have. She didn't let herself think about that. They gave her the bunkhouse. It was a single room behind the barn, small and plain, with a cot and a wood stove and a window that looked out on the east pasture. It was cleaner than she expected. Someone had swept it recently. There was a quilt folded at the end of the cot that had been mended in 3 places with careful, even stitches. She sat on the edge of the cot that first night and listened to the land settle around her, the cattle in the near pasture, the creak of the barn. Far off, something, a coyote maybe, or just the wind coming down off the ridge. She'd slept in worse places. She'd slept in a lot of worse places. In the morning, she was up before the sun, which she figured was the only currency she had with Chester Whitfield right now. He was already in the barn. He didn't say good morning. He handed her a bucket. She took it. They worked the morning without talking much, which suited Della fine. Chester was a man who said what needed saying and left the rest alone. She could see that in the first hour. He showed her the cattle. 83 head, mixed breed, some of them older than they should have been kept, but quality animals still. He showed her the fence line that needed work on the north end, 2 posts rotted at the base, and a section of wire gone slack. He showed her where the tools were kept, and how the water system ran from the creek up to the tank, and where it tended to block when the summer got dry. He showed her things a man doesn't show a stranger unless he's already made up his mind about them on some level, even if he hasn't said so yet. Around midday, Louisa appeared at the barn door with 2 plates and set them on the workbench without comment. She stood for a moment looking at what Della had done to the near stall, which was to muck it out completely and relay the bedding in a way that gave the horse in it more room than it had had before. Old Hap doesn't usually let anyone in that stall, Louisa said. Della looked at the horse, a gray gelding with the expression of a creature who has seen things. We came to an understanding. Louisa looked at her a moment, longer than felt casual. Then she picked up her own plate and went back to the house. That was the second day. The weeks after that were plain, hard work, and Della threw herself into it the way she threw herself into all things she was unsure of. Completely, and without much sleep. She fixed the fence line on the north end, replacing both posts herself and restringing the wire tight enough that Chester walked the whole length of it one morning and didn't say anything, which Della was beginning to understand was his version of praise. She helped move the cattle to the east pasture when the near grass got low. She repaired a section of the barn roof that had been letting weather in, and she did it in a way that wouldn't need to be done again, using good cedar shingles she'd bought herself in Red Fork, out of what little she had left. When Chester saw that, he looked at it for a long time. "You bought those yourself," he said. It wasn't a question. "The ones you had were pine," Della said. "Pine won't last the winter up there." He didn't say anything. But at dinner that night, he passed her the bread first, before Louisa, which in the Whitfield household she would come to understand was a significant thing. She was careful with Louisa. She understood without being told that Louisa was the one whose opinion actually mattered here, which was not a slight against Chester. Chester was the land and the cattle and the day-to-day, but Louisa was the one who decided what the Whitfield place was for and who it was for. That was a different kind of authority, quieter and harder to earn. So Della helped with the kitchen garden without being asked. She didn't make a production of it. She just noticed the beans needed tying one afternoon, and she tied them. She noticed the squash was getting into the tomatoes, and she cleared it back. Small things. She was careful not to do them in a way that suggested Louisa hadn't been managing, Because Louisa had been managing, she'd been managing everything. It was just that lately there was too much managing and not enough hours. One evening, Louisa came out to the garden and found Della at the end of the bean row and stood for a moment looking at the work. "You didn't have to do this," Louisa said. "It needed doing," Della said. Louisa was quiet. Then, "You like growing things?" "I used to," Della said, and stopped there because saying more would have meant going further back than she wanted to go. Just then, Louisa didn't push, but she sat down on the low stool she kept by the garden, and they worked the last of the evening light together. And Della found herself thinking, carefully, guardedly, that this was the closest thing to easy she'd felt in 2 years. She didn't let herself trust that feeling. Not yet. The trouble came in the 3rd week, the way trouble tends to come in open country, without much warning and from a direction you weren't watching. A man named Harlow Beach showed up at the property line on a Thursday morning while Chester was in town for supplies. Della was working the water line when she heard the horses and came around the side of the barn and saw him. 2 men with him, both sitting their horses, like they were being paid to look intimidating, which they probably were. Harlow Beach was the kind of man who'd been told he was important often enough that he'd started to believe it was a quality he was born with. He was 40-odd, broad, with a rancher's hands and a businessman's eyes, and he rode right up to the edge of the yard and didn't bother announcing himself. "I need to speak with Chester Whitfield," he said. "Chester's not here," Della said. He looked at her the way men like Harlow Beach always looked at her, like she was an inconvenience that hadn't been accounted for. "Who are you?" "I work here," Della said. "When will he be back?" "This afternoon." "You're welcome to wait in town." Something moved across Harlow's face that wasn't quite amusement. "I'll wait here," he said, and started to ride forward. "I didn't invite you onto the property," Della said. She said it plainly without heat, just as a fact. The kind of fact that a reasonable person would recognize and a foolish one would ignore. Harlow looked at her again. This time he was actually seeing her. She'd straightened up from the water line and was standing with her hands at her sides, and she wasn't moving, and she wasn't afraid of him, which he hadn't expected. "You know who I am," he said. "I know you're on the wrong side of the fence line," Della said. There was a pause. One of the men behind Harlow shifted his horse. The other one looked at Della with an expression that was harder to read, something between caution and something that might have been respect. Harlow made a decision that surprised her. He turned his horse. "Tell Chester I'll be back," he said, "and tell him I'm making that offer one more time. After that, I won't bother." They rode out. Della stood and watched until they were off the property. Then she went back to the water line, because the line wasn't going to fix itself just because Harlow Beach had ridden up. Her hands were steady. She'd made sure of that, but she thought about it the rest of the morning. And when Chester came back from town, she was waiting for him by the barn. She told him what happened, all of it, straight through, including what she'd said. Chester listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the east pasture. "Harlow's been trying to buy this land for 3 years," he said. "Seems like a man who's used to getting what he wants," Della said. "He is," Chester said. "He bought out the Garrity place to the south of us. Got the Fenner water rights on the creek upstream. He's been squeezing us." He was still looking at the pasture. "The spring before last, we lost 40 head to something that might have been bad water and might not have been." Della heard what was in that and what wasn't. "What do you need?" she said. Chester looked at her then, fully the same way he'd looked at the cedar shingles on the barn roof. "Right now," he said, "I need someone who'll still be standing here in the morning." It wasn't until later, walking back to the bunkhouse in the dark, that Della thought about those words and realized they landed somewhere she hadn't expected. She lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and thought about her horse, which was in the barn and had eaten well today, and about the quilt with the 3 careful patches, and about the way the bean row looked in the evening light when the sun got low. She thought about Harlow Beach and what he was building to. She thought about Chester's question, "Who told you we were short a hand?" and the way he'd asked it, and whether Mick Dooley at the feed store had told her, or whether she'd just said that because she needed to say something. She wasn't ready to answer that question, not even to herself. What happened next happened over 2 weeks, and then all at once. The water to the Whitfield property dropped. Not to nothing, that would have been too obvious, but enough. Enough that the tank that fed the north pasture was low every morning, and the cattle were restless, and Chester spent 3 days walking the creek line looking for where the blockage was. Della went with him upstream past the property line onto land she technically had no right to be on, and she found it on the second day. A diversion. Someone had put in a small timber diversion about 200 yards into Fenner land Harlow now controlled, that was pulling water away from the main channel. Chester looked at it for a long time. "I could remove it," Della said. "That's trespassing. It's water theft." Chester crouched down and put his hand in the creek. "I know what it is," he said quietly. "I also know what it costs to fight a man like Harlow in court, and I know what it costs to fight him the other way." "So what do you do?" Della said. "I document it," Chester said, standing up. "I go into town and I talk to a lawyer and I document every last piece of it, and I make sure that when this goes where it's going, we've done it right." Della looked at him, at the lines in his face and the set of his jaw and the way he was choosing, right now, to do the harder thing on purpose. "All right," she said. She helped him do it right. She measured the diversion and sketched it, and Chester had her numbers written up properly by a man in Red Fork who did that kind of work. She testified to what she'd seen on the creek, which meant giving her name to a document and attaching herself to the Whitfield's legal trouble in a way that she could not undo. She did it without being asked, without hesitating. When she came out of the lawyer's office with Chester, he looked at her on the sidewalk and said, "You didn't have to put your name on that." "You needed a witness," Della said. He looked at her the way Louisa had looked at her that evening in the garden, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see and was taking his time deciding what to call it. "You have people?" he said. "Family somewhere?" Della looked at the street, a wagon going by, 2 horses, the driver not paying attention to either of them. "No," she said, "not anymore." Chester nodded, just nodded like he was filing that away carefully, and they walked back to where the truck was parked and didn't talk about it again. But something had changed. Della felt it, and she suspected Chester felt it too. Louisa asked her once, about a week after the legal business, why she'd left her last position. They were in the kitchen. Louisa was making something that smelled like the best thing Della had encountered since the previous winter, and Della was at the table with a cup of coffee she'd been cradling for 20 minutes because she wasn't ready to leave. She could have lied. She'd been prepared to lie since before she arrived. She told the truth instead. Not all of it, but enough. She told Louisa about Dale Renner and what he'd decided she owed him. She didn't dress it up or ask for sympathy. She told it straight, like a report. Louisa kept her hands on what she was doing and didn't look at Della, which Della appreciated. Being looked at during that story would have been too much. When Della was done, there was a silence. "And his father chose him," Louisa said. It wasn't quite a question. "His father chose the easy version," Della said. Another silence. Then Louisa said, without turning, "I had a daughter who married a man like that. Not Renner's boy. Someone else. Different name, same." She stopped, started again. "We don't see her much." Della looked at her cup. "I'm sorry." "We've made our peace with it," Louisa said, in a way that meant they hadn't entirely, but they were managing. "Life doesn't always give you the family you expect." She said it plainly, not dramatically, and she kept her hands moving, and that was it. That was the whole conversation. But that night at dinner, Chester said something to Della about the north pasture fence needing work in the spring. In the spring, as though it were already decided, and Louisa passed her the bread first, before Chester. And Della sat at that table and ate her supper and felt something she couldn't quite name pressing against the inside of her chest. She didn't fight it this time. She was tired of fighting everything. The legal matter with Harlow resolved the way honest things sometimes do. Not dramatically, but definitively. The documentation held. The water diversion was ruled unlawful and Chester's creek rights were confirmed, with costs to Harlow's operation. There was no confrontation, no moment of triumph, just a letter from the lawyer that Chester read at the kitchen table with Louisa standing at his shoulder, and then sat down and said all right, and had a second cup of coffee. Harlow Beach rode past the property once after that. Didn't stop. Della was working the fence near the road, and she watched him go, and he looked at her, and she held his gaze until he was past the property line, and then she went back to the fence. She didn't hear from the Renner family. She hadn't expected to. What she hadn't expected was the letter from her brother. She got it in town, at the post office, because she'd finally given the Whitfield address when she'd put her name on the legal document and her brother had tracked her down through. Well, it was a long story that involved their cousin and a feed store in a town she hadn't been to in 3 years. The point was the letter came. He was in Colorado. Married, 2 kids, some kind of shop work. He wanted to know if she was all right. He said he'd been looking for her, in the way people look for someone when they feel guilty about not looking harder sooner. Della sat on the post office step and read it twice. She didn't have a complicated feeling about her brother. She'd loved him when they were young, and they'd lost track of each other in the way that happens when a family breaks apart, and everyone lands somewhere different, and the distance becomes years before you know it. There was grief in that. There was also just life, the way it goes. She wrote back. She wrote that she was in the valley working a ranch, that she was well. She wrote the Whitfield address without thinking about it, and then looked at what she'd written and thought about the fact that she'd given that address like it was a thing she had, like it was real. She mailed the letter. On the way back to the ranch, she thought about the kitchen garden and the cedar shingles and old Hap the gray gelding, who now let her brush him out without complaint. She thought about the bunkhouse and the quilt with the 3 patches and the way the barn door looked in the afternoon, that particular color between red and rose. She thought about what Louisa had said. Life doesn't always give you the family you expect. And she thought about the bread being passed to her first, and Chester saying in the spring like it was a settled thing. It was the kind of thought she'd been keeping at arm's length for months. She let it come the rest of the way now. She pulled up at the property line. The fence posts were all even now, new and old alike, and the wire was tight the whole length of it. From here she could see the barn, that particular color, and smoke coming from the chimney of the house, because Louisa had the stove going, and the east pasture, where the cattle were grazing in the late afternoon, and everything was quiet. Chester came out of the barn and saw her and lifted his hand. She lifted hers back. Then she rode through the gate onto the Whitfield property, and she didn't feel like a stranger riding in anymore, and she noticed that, and she let herself notice it. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place where they fit. Some of them find it in a house they were born to, or a family they expected, or a love they went looking for. And some of them, the ones the road has shaped into something tougher and quieter and more careful than they started out. Some of them ride up to a fence line in bad shape, on a worn-out horse with 17 cents in their pocket, and they find it there, where they weren't looking. In the work they do, and the trust they earn, and the bread passed first without making a thing of it. Della Crane didn't have a word for what the Whitfield place had become to her. She just rode in through the gate, put her horse up for the night, and came to the table when Louisa called her, and stayed.